Yet again, you've lapsed. You've lost count of a number of times this has happened, how long you've been in addiction, and yet again, you've lapsed. You've used, you've binged, you sit there full of self-loathing and shame and wonder to yourself, how did this happen? What caused this? Why am I so powerless over my addiction? There's a hopelessness after a period of sobriety, and you don't really see how abstinence would make sense, how it would work for you. That's where this video comes in. This video is teaching the skill of behavioural chain analysis. By finishing it up within half an hour, you will have learned a skill that you can use to gain some agency and some understanding over a lapse, over the steps that led up to it, what contributed to those steps in the first place, how to change things in the future so you're less likely to go down that well-trodden neural pathway, and also how to be able to somewhat make amends and sweep up the carnage left as a result of that lapse. My name is Simon. I'm a counsellor based in Oxford, and this is our second video in our series of DBT for addiction. Originally, I was going to teach 4 different skills in this video, but I felt like behavioural chain analysis really needed its own space, its own video just to talk about it, because it's so useful in an area where we can quite often feel helplessness or shame over when we've lapsed, and when it's just really helpful to have a methodology that we can use to talk through it and take something from it. Mostly in this video, I will be talking about lapse or addiction. I'm thinking substance misuse, drug abuse, alcohol, that kind of thing. But you can apply it to a lot of targeted behaviours. You can apply it to things like self-harm, suicide, pornography use, binge eating, smoking, gambling. You can apply it to more or less any kind of behaviour that you are looking to change and gain insight on. DBT is a more skills-based approach to therapy involving a lot of psychoeducation that was originally developed by Marshall Linehan in the 90s as a way of working with dangerous targeted behaviours, particularly suicidal ideation, and later applied to borderline personality disorder, which is a personality disorder that's often developed a lot in response to childhood traumas, the same childhood traumas that often contribute towards addiction if we are an addict. And as such, in targeting certain behaviours, in working with people who struggle to tolerate strong emotions and distress can knock us off our edge, it also works really wonderfully for addiction. We will look at behavioural chain analysis. When we have lapsed, when we have done a targeted behaviour that we are trying to work on, behavioural chain analysis breaks down what led up to it, what contributed towards it, what happened afterwards. It breaks it down into steps, and at each step we're thinking if there is any alternate behaviour or skill we could have used that would have had a different result, and then considering what the weakest point in the chain is that we could change. The idea isn't to shame us or to ruminate on what happened before, it's to think about steps that we could take in the future to have more control and to be aware when we are at risk of lapse in the future. So our first skill, technique, whatever you want to call it, was behavioural chain analysis. And this was the skill that we are likely to use if we have lapsed, relapsed, or at least put ourselves in a real high-risk situation that we would like to gain more insight, control, awareness, the ability to be able to change that in the future, to make amends, to improve on it so that we don't go down that well-trodden path again. And I'm going to teach this skill twice. The first time round, I'll teach a easier version of it. It's the version that I'd like you to hold in your mind. It's quite simple to conceptualize. You can go through it with your sponsor. Actually, if you've ever done something like relapse prevention planning, this is the body of relapse prevention planning. And then the second time round, we'll talk a little bit more about things like vulnerability factors, prompting events, which in the recovery circles you might have heard described more as triggers, and consequences and how that can lead to things like making amends. But it's really an expansion. This is how the DBT workbook teaches it, but it's really an expansion on that very simple chaining that we're covering in the first explanation of the skill. Simple version. I want you to imagine that you have relapsed. You've drunk, you've scored drugs, you've done some ineffective, addictive behavior, and you feel so shameful around it. But you have relapsed and you are trying to reflect on what happened so that you can change it for the future. This is where behavioural chain analysis comes in. What you're going to do is you are going to brainstorm all of the steps between the relapse itself and what led up to it. And you can even go a little bit further, but you're going to break it down into small steps to get an understanding of what happened that led to that, that led to that, that led to that, which eventually led towards a relapse. And it may be that you want to start on the day or a little bit before the day of the actual lapse, the actual event, and then work down. Or it may be that you want to work from the relapse upwards and kind of retroactively go back to think about what contributed to what. But that's the essence of it. I'd like you, for the first step, to just do a chain of events which led towards the relapse. Above, here's an example of one that I wrote that you might do. So imagine it's your day off and you're bored. I don't know, you may have watched films, played the same familiar games, and they're not quite that interesting. You're not that enamored with them. You're bored, and you think to yourself, I've not had dinner yet. I best go to the shop, pick something up. Got nothing in. Let's have a frozen pizza. So you make your way over to the co-op to get yourself dinner, and on the way to the co-op, you walk by the churchyard. The churchyard being a very famous place where people sit and drink or use, and you recognize a couple of people as you walk by them. You see them drinking in the churchyard, and you think to yourself, you know what, I might be bored, but my life's been quite interesting. I've made a lot of progress. I'm gonna have a quick chat, just say hello to them, and I'm gonna tell them about how well I'm doing, about how things are. And you go up and you talk to somebody you used to know, you get chatting to them, say their street name, and it's quite an enjoyable chat. It's good to see them. They give you a hug, they talk to you, they seem quite interested in how you're going in your life, and they offer you a beer. You think to yourself, oh, should I take it? Should I not take it? You have been clean for, I don't know, let's say 6 months or so, and you think, you know, I can probably just handle just one. This is really nice to catch up with my mate. And you sit down, you have a beer with this person. You drink, you enjoy it, it touches your lips, and you find yourself with that thought over your mind, maybe I'll get another one. And so you do pop to the co-op, but forgetting completely to buy the frozen pizza, maybe you buy yourself a meal deal instead. But what you also buy is a crate of beer. You buy lots of them, and then you work your way back to the graveyard. You see your mate, you repay the debt. You repay the debt for him and a couple of other people, and you get totally pissed in that graveyard. And then before long, you've relapsed. The second step in our basic version of behavioural chain analysis is to look at every single one of those chains that you've created and to think about an alternate activity or a skill that you could use instead of the chain which led towards your relapse. And again, I've stuck an image up in the corner. So our first stage was being bored on our day off. Could we use a skill like ABC Please? Could we have activities, routine? Could we be looking after our general well-being so that that sense of boredom and loneliness was less likely to almost start as a bit of a trigger for this whole thing? Our second stage was going to the co-op so we could get our dinner. We had no food in. So could we plan our food for the week? Could we make it so that we are less likely to go to the co-op? And when we went to the co-op, we walked by that graveyard. Could we go the long way round? Even if it's an extra half a kilometre, we're bored anyway. Can we go the long way round, even though it's a bit boring, even though it's a bit longer? Can we go the long way round so we're not walking by a triggering place that might make us want to use. Think last video when we were talking a bit about bridge burning. Can we burn the bridge so we don't bump into people? Anyway, we do move on to the next stage, and we walk by the churchyard and we spot people who are drinking. Can we use some of the skills in the interpersonal affective module? Can we use some refusal skills that we've picked up in rehab to just outright avoid talking to those people who we know are still in active addiction? But we don't. We go on to the next stage and we bump into an old associate, someone that we have drank heavily with, and what there? Could we hold on to our clear mind, that skill we talked about in the last video? Could we remember that we are an addict, we're at high risk of relapse? And can we use assertiveness skills to be very clear about what our boundaries are, that we're not going to drink? We may even just try and keep the conversation to a minimum rather than indulging it. There's a saying in AA that if you go to the hairdressers enough, eventually you're going to get a haircut. If you hang out in the churchyard where everyone drinks enough, eventually you're quite likely to have a drink. But we don't do that. We end up chatting to them, and we're offered a can of beer. So instead, could we use the stop skill, which is, I'll cover it if I do another video, but it's literally around just bloody stopping, pausing, having a bit of an opportunity to think about what's happening. Can we outright refuse? Oh no, sorry mate, I don't drink anymore. Could we do some pros and cons in our head? It doesn't have to be a big written out diagram. Can we just do some pros and cons about the benefits and the costs of accepting that beer? We don't do that. We accept the beer instead and move on to our next stage of a chain. We haven't stopped, we haven't walked away, we've had a drink. Is there anything we can change at this point? Could we instead call our sponsor? Could we make a plan? Could we go back home and think, sod it, it's too dangerous for me to go to the shop. Maybe instead I will go to KFC and I get my dinner there because I know they don't sell alcohol. But we don't. We go to the shop. And so again, is there something we could change? Could we buy an energy drink? If we're going to buy beer, can we buy alcohol-free beer? Low alcohol beer? Let's just avoid the beer aisle altogether. Is there anything we can do to minimize our chances of buying alcohol at the co-op? But we don't do that. We get the meal deal and we get the crate of beer instead, and then we go back home. We go back to the graveyard. Again, is there anything we could do? Could we just drop the bloody can of beer on the floor and think, sod it, I'm not going to drink, just go straight back home? Could we build mindful awareness and think, what the hell is going on, and give our sponsor a ring? Could we drop the crates off at the churchyard and say, really good seeing you guys, thanks for the beer, I'm not here anymore, but here's the crate, I'm off? Instead, we don't do that. We drink excessively, and now we've reached a place of relapse. Again, is there anything that we could do before it gets to that point when we're starting to be filled with shame? Is there anything we could do? Can we reach out? Can we call our sponsor? Can we get support? Can we go to a meeting? Can we practice some distress tolerance techniques to, again, just kind of feel ourselves grounded? Is there anything we can do at this stage? And that's behavioural chain analysis. It's going through after a relapse and it's building up all of the different events that led to that relapse, and then it's considering alternate behaviour that we could do instead. And then what I'd like you to do after that is to think about which of those points was the weakest point in the chain. If I had a paper chain made out of bits of paper and I pull it apart, the whole thing wouldn't shatter. It'd be one or two bits of paper that would break. And in the same way, what of all of these steps, which of them would be the easiest one to break? So I would suggest the easiest one to break, which would change the whole outcome, would simply be to walk the long way round, to avoid walking to the church, or to have worked on your routine so you weren't likely to be bored at home, or to have gone shopping for the whole week so you weren't thinking, oh, I've got nothing in, I best go get a pizza. When we're hungry, our willpower is likely to be low. So that's it. That's the basic version. Remember it, use it. It doesn't have to be complicated. I know there's a lot of writing on the page, but that's very simply it. Just come up with a list of things that have happened, think about alternate behavior at every single point, and then think about the next time which is the one that I would change. And this isn't about shaming you, it's always about thinking about next time. So that's the basics of behavioural chain analysis. Just if you have a lapse or ineffective behaviour, look at the steps that led up to that lapse and see if there is anything that you could change or do differently at different stages, and the easiest one to break. But if you look at the DBT workbook, handout 7 and 7a, Marshall Linehan goes into a little bit more detail. So on the behavioural chain itself, there is more inquiry as to what exactly is going on. And before the chain starts, it talks a bit more about vulnerability factors, the prompting events, and then after the chain, it talks a bit more about consequences. So stick with the first one, just remember those principles, but I'll quickly cover the slightly more advanced version of behavioural chain analysis, and that might just give you a little bit more to think about or take out when you are doing it. So in the workbook, it suggests starting at the actual lapse, the actual problem behaviour. And it says to describe it in a lot of details, almost as though you were writing a script so that an actor could play the part and play out the lapse that happened. It then asks you to talk in quite a bit of detail about the prompting event. And in recovery, you might have heard prompting events talked about as triggers instead. The thing that triggered this whole series of change, which ultimately led up towards the target behavior, the lapse. In our example, I would say the prompting event was probably going to the graveyard or walking through the graveyard, but you can backtrack a bit earlier and say maybe it was the boredom that was the triggering event. There was something in your actual environment which started off this whole chain of events which led towards a lapse, and it asked you to do that with a lot of inquiry into what happened. So thinking about what thoughts were going on, were there any images in your mind, what were you feeling at the time, what happened in the environment to cue this series of events which ultimately led towards the lapse. The next stage, and all of this so far is the kind of mindful inquiry stage, just trying to fit the facts of what actually happened in the situation. The next stage is to look at the vulnerability factors. In DBT, this is very much the please skill. So are there any physical illnesses that you're not treating that are making you feel worse? Are you finding that your diet's okay? Are you eating enough? How are you doing in your recovery? Have you had a mini use up? Let's say you have taken too many sleeping pills that you're prescribed that day and that's contributing towards it. How's your sense of sleep? Are you physically tired? Are you getting enough exercise, or are you being quite kind of isolated? Outside of a police skill, how are you doing in your social life at the moment? Are you feeling lonely? Are there intense emotions going on for you? In recovery, you might have heard the acronym HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. HALT. So use the please skill, use that acronym HALT. Think about a very quick inventory of how your life is going as a whole, considering how that might predispose you to a lapse. A lapse is rarely a quick isolated thing, and the behavioural chain will break that down in the surrounding day. But the idea of looking at vulnerability factors is looking further back in your story to think about what would have made you particularly vulnerable to lapse at the time. You may want to have watched the previous video where we were talking about things like bridge burning. Are there certain bridges that would predispose you? Are there certain behavioral addictions, certain old behaviors which are coming up, which again are kind of getting you thinking along the trajectory of lapse? So that's vulnerability factors, thinking about what makes you vulnerable as a whole to lapse. The next stage is pretty much exactly what we covered in the basic description of behavioural chain analysis. It goes into a little bit more inquiry details, so it expands it. Most of what we talked about were more actions that happened or things that other people did. It expands it a little bit to also talk about any sensations you were feeling, any cognitions you had, the environment, things that other people did. It expands it a little bit, but it more or less continues what we did in the first stage. So thinking about a number of chains which led up towards the actual problem behavior, the lapse, and then considering if there are any other options that someone else may have done or you could have done for next time. Step 5 of this behavioural chain analysis is the final part of this more inquiry focused area, which is really just trying to ascertain what exactly happened. And that is to look at the consequences of a problem behaviour, consequences of the lapse in this case, both in the immediate, how that impacted you and other people around you, but also thinking about more long-term consequences that may have happened as a result of what happened. The 6th step of behavioural chain, now that you've got a good idea of exactly what happened, and maybe you've already got a little idea of some alternate potential steps on the links, the 6th step is to go through in an awful lot of detail and look at every single link and consider what skillful behavior, whether those are DBT skills or recovery skills or problem solving, what could you have done differently that would have changed the outcome? Particularly, it asks you to actually circle any chains where if you broke it, it would completely change the outcome of the lapse. So in our example, things like refusal skills, when you see the person or meet the person or start talking to the person so that it doesn't lead towards accepting a beer off them. Things like please skills, so manage our vulnerability factors, so we're less likely to go out and need that pizza and then be tired or whatever, bored, and more likely to score. Things like our distress tolerance skills, so that we're less likely to find ourselves overwhelmed when we walk into the supermarket and end up wanting to buy the beer. Go through each of them and consider specific links that you could actually break. So very similar to the first iteration of this skill. Now that we have a real understanding of the chain of events which led towards a lapse and what we could do differently or skillfully to have a different outcome, is to make a prevention plan, what you might have otherwise heard described as a relapse prevention plan. So it's looking at the specific things that happened and what we could do differently next time, which will keep us safe and reduce our risk of relapse. This is really the toolbox that we're going to use so that we're unlikely to go to our target behavior again in the future. And then the final stage is to look at those consequences, what the actual damage that we've caused to ourselves or to other people is, and then to, if appropriate, repair it. If you're doing 12 steps at the moment, the actual making amends is fairly late on. The first steps are really about creating a moral inventory and talking to your sponsor about the consequences of what you've done before you actually go out trying to make amends for it. And amends can look a little bit more abstract if we're talking about something like lapsing. It may be that we have, for example, betrayed our family or a friend's trust. They thought we were doing well in our recovery. In our example, I said, let's pretend we've been clean for 6 months and then we've picked up again. It's a natural part of recovery to lapse, but people might lose faith in us, and repair is literally just getting back on that horse and rebuilding trust in people. Repair can also look like quite a practical thing. The DBT workbook says don't go buying people flowers and chocolates when you've smashed in their window. Get the window repaired. And it might be that we have, I don't know, robbed our mum because we need to buy gear. A practical repair might be setting up a repayment plan to give her back some of the money we owe, rather than just saying I'm sorry and writing a letter. So think about the consequences and think about repair and what repair would look like. And I'd also like you to think about if repair is realistic and if it in any way harms the other person to try and repair. This is something that you'll very much cover if you do something like the 12-step programs. But I would talk it through with someone else about what repair looks like and whose needs we're meeting in trying to repair them. But that's the final stage of behavioural chain analysis, advanced version anyway. It's thinking about the consequences and just what practical things we might need to do to repair them. So we've done behavioural chain. We have got a real good amount of insight into what the behaviour is, what's caused it, what's predisposed us to it, what we could do differently at different stages. We've taken all of that goodness and baked it into a cake, a recovery plan of what we could do differently next time. And then we've looked at the fallout, the consequences of it, and we've tried to make amends for those so that it's not haunting us. All in all, I would say that's a pretty good skill. That's pretty useful. It takes the most dangerous aspects of our problem behavior and it switches it around to one, protect us, two, protect other people, and three, to change things so we're less likely to go there again. What a great skill. Thank you so much for listening. My name's Simon. I'm a counsellor based online or face-to-face in Oxford, and I've got over 5 years experience in facilitating groups of people in recovery from substance misuse. You can reach me on my website at www.simonslistening.co.uk, which includes my contact details if you want to get in contact for counselling yourself. You may also be interested in a blog or another YouTube video on that site talking about DBT for addiction. Our last video covered skills such as cost-benefit analysis, clear mind, urge surfing, and bridge burning. And there are lots of other great videos on there, including stuff on DBT, like DBT for impossible decisions, and other things on recovery, like me talking about my own journey 2.5 years or so ago of stopping drinking and just some of the lessons I picked up during that. Do feel free to leave a comment. I'd be fascinated to know if you have any tips in general around dealing with lapses or the process you might go through to feel less shame. I'd be fascinated to read them and do tend to respond to every comment. But please do bear in mind that comments on YouTube are out in the public domain and anyone can read it. Thank you again for listening, and I wish you peace and clarity in the rest of your day.